The training center was run by an American general, and the master trainer was also American. Under them was a large group of Americans in charge of weapons, teaching, and training. Stilwell, determined to wreak revenge for the humiliation he had received in Burma, even brought in his youngest son and his son-in-law to help with the training. Stilwell's plan was ambitious. He wanted to have 10 Chinese divisions in India, all fully armed with American weapons ready to fight in northern Burma. He planned to call this army Army X. But he also planned to train and arm another 30 Chinese divisions in the Kunming base in Yunnan province to take back the New Jiang River, which was held by the Japanese. He would call this army Y. And in Guilin, Guangxi, he wanted to have 30 Chinese divisions also armed with American weapons. He called this army Z. It would fight with armies X and Y in the coming counterattack. Hopefully, they would wipe out all Japanese forces in the country. Armed with American weapons was the general ideal. It had different levels when applied in practice, but the Chinese forces in India had everything from clothing to gear to weapons. The 2 tank battalions could hardly ever have been imagined by the most audacious mind back in China. The 1st Tank Battalion had 30 medium Sherman tanks, each weighing 32 tons. In front of these massive beasts, the Japanese Model 95 and 97 tanks looked like toys. The Stuart light tanks the 2nd Battalion had at their disposal were also efficient killing machines. The best Japanese tank, the 97, needed to get within 300 metres of its target before it could have any hope of destroying it. The Stuart, on the other hand, could achieve that at 500 metres.
日军的那个小坦克怎么挡得住？谢尔曼斯最小的坦克叫霞飞，轻型坦克，那霞飞到20几吨啊，也是日本坦克不可比拟的。日本到了8吨到10吨，他就被他自己称为轻型坦克，就有炮了，很小的炮，炮筒也短，射程也近。
All these weapons were a dream for the forces back in China. But even after they were armed with American equipment, Group Army Y still had insufficient artillery. In most cases, each army within the group had a greatly inferior firing power compared with the division in the Chinese forces in India. As for Group Army Z, in the end, it was never founded. Before that could be arranged, Chiang Kai-shek had Stilwell sent back to the United States. Fully armed and fully staffed, both the 22nd and the 38th Divisions had firepower that could match any field division of the Allied armies. Each, apart from regiments, had under it a 105 caliber howitzer battalion, a 75 caliber mountain artillery battalion, a telecommunications battalion, a transportation battalion, an engineering battalion, a scout company, a special service company, an equipment maintenance company, a team of medics, and a complete field hospital.
我负责改铁，全副我们负责黄买国是黄买国黄买是装备，关键我们这装备是好过的，一坦克，一加农炮，还15片子炮，还有榴弹炮，我们榴弹炮，还有坦克炮，好，那炮是多的，还派给我们飞机。10个中的10个大的飞机，100多辆飞机飞机。
Each of the 2 divisions had 3 infantry regiments, and each regiment had 3 infantry battalions, and a unit directly under the regiment headquarters. All put together, each regiment had 2,750 men. Each fighting unit, be it a company, a platoon or a squad, had formidable firepower, right down to each soldier.
今年军力志向15支冲锋枪，对，15支冲锋，一个绑架一冲锋枪，枪顶上枪，一个绑，这个鼓励的是火枪，鼓励这么的，一个月呢，一个年枪支枪， 然后常务的就是迫击炮，师务的是山炮、野炮。
After this reorganization, each of the two divisions had 12,500 men, 3,000 more than a German division in 1939. Apart from their new weapons, each had everything needed for a modern war. Formidable firepower, good maneuverability, and fast and efficient logistical support. In all regards, each surpassed a Japanese first-class division founded in 1944. Each division had numerous school graduates. In this regard, the Chinese forces in India were superior to any army back in China, including a second Chinese expeditionary force being organized in Yunnan, also known as Army Y. The division commanding officers were the 22nd and the 38th Sun Liren and Liao Yaoxiang, had a better education than most of the generals in China. Sun Liren had graduated from the Virginia Military Institute, while Liao Yaoxiang was a graduate of the Special Military School founded by Napoleon.
所以这支军队在这样的氛围下，它逐渐变成一支国际化军队。它参与的是一个国际战场，它参与的不仅仅是中国抗战，它参与的是二战，它是一个国际战场。它的盟友都是西方的先进国家。那么这支军队加上这支军队的士兵、军官，尤其是士兵，都是有文化的士兵，所以它成为一支国际化军队。
After a year of tough training, the new recruits were skilled soldiers. They were cheerful, they were good fighters, and their morale was strong. The training base had become a first-class military academy for the upcoming Burma campaign.
美国人在那个地方办了很多军事学校，比如步兵学校，比如工兵学校，比如坦克兵学校、通讯兵学校、驾驶兵学校，办了很多。所有的兵，哪怕你是一个步兵，你也得去步兵学校学3个月。就是说，这3个月把你从一个平民，哪怕是穿上军装的平民，变成一个真正的士兵。你会懂得怎么作战，怎么增强体质，战略战术怎么服从，等等等等，学习一个军人最基本的东西。
In these schools, the Chinese school graduate soldiers showed they could acquire new knowledge very quickly. Within a week, they could operate cannons, and by a few weeks later, some, without any previous knowledge of radio codes, reached a level many American decoders took 13 weeks to achieve.
我们训练的也很严格，那就是一天上午2个钟头的队列训练，然后有2个钟头的射击教练啊，这些步兵操练等等嘛，就是这一类的。然后就是我整个下午就是野外训练。所谓野外训练就是匍匐前进啊，就是那些绕境啊，这个反正就是在战场上的一些基本动作嘛。所以那个是最紧张，我可以说我在部队里是从来没有过过一天清闲日子。
Live ammunition was used in all the training sessions. In fact, the number of live shells fired per session was set as a requirement. The commanding officer of each artillery unit had to personally supervise his men firing 400 shells before he was qualified to graduate. Every day, the training centre was like a battleground, with gunfire and explosions going on night and day, and the Americans had more than enough ammunition. The fighting skills of the young Chinese soldiers progressed quickly.
还是跟日本人比的话，还算是要好强一点，因为日本人他最主要的战术是冲锋和刺杀，他的那种民族性决定了你。他的这个撇刺啊， 当时来说，在我们没有冲锋枪之前，我们都很难的跟他拉平。他就是每一个士兵的那个皮尺，他的体力跟他的那个都比较厉害。但是我们自从每一个班配一支冲锋枪过后，汤姆森冲锋枪配了以后，因为那个一个弹夹是30发，那就是拿的就可以手上就可以混扫。你冲锋你拿起步枪来的话，你还没有，也许还没到我身边，我都已经把你放倒了。这个武器当时来说，我们是比他就要先进些。
The latest weapons, good quality soldiers and tough training worked together to make the Chinese soldiers as good as any British or American soldiers on the battlefield. This was proven in later counterattacks when 200,000 Chinese troops from Yunnan annihilated 23,000 enemy troops, and just 40,000 Chinese troops in India wiped out 25,000 enemy soldiers. These figures reveal the formidable fighting power of the Chinese troops in India. In May 1942, the Allied armies retreated into India to engage in battles with the Japanese that will continue in seesaw fashion for more than a year. While training the Chinese troops, the Allied armies changed their tactics by sending small teams to harass the Japanese army. Among these teams, the most successful and the most legendary was the British Chindits. The Chindits was a special force formed into long-range penetration groups that operated deep behind Japanese lines. The mastermind behind this force was British Brigadier Ordu Wingate. The members of this independent force were from Britain, India, Burma and Gurkhistan, and they were all tough fighters who could cope with jungle warfare. Their name, Chindits, came from an animal of legend said to protect temples in Burma. In early February 1943, 3,000 Chindits entered Burma on foot from India. These men were jungle warriors, and they knew how to survive in humid, hot and hostile environments. They brought with them just a few basic supplies because they wanted to take their targets by surprise. Extra provisions would be dropped to them later. Within a month, the Chindits successfully put 2 railways in Mandalay and Nyat-Kina, lifelines to Japanese troops, out of use. This then forced the Japanese to send troops to guard the railways. But this success put the Japanese troops on high alert. They then searched every inch of the jungle for the scent of the Chindits, and before long, they sniffed them out. After several highly successful missions, Wingate began to take too many risks. On a mission to rescue POWs, he made a serious error when he ordered his men to cross the Ayeyarwady River. In doing so, he left his men completely without cover from Allied airplanes and exposed to Japanese troops. The enemy then pursued, besieged and cornered them, leaving Wingate no way out. Wingate and his men fought desperately, and they managed to cross the Ayeyarwady River and make their way back into the jungle. But then, on their way back to India, their route was cut. Retreat, as a group, became impossible. Wingate's men dispersed, but only 200 out of 3,000 men managed to return. This daring penetration effort deep behind the Japanese line ended in failure, but Wingate's tactics and his men's dare-or-die spirit became legendary. To people in Britain, he was a hero, and what he had done changed the usually pessimistic view of the British people about the war in the Far East. The British were convinced that they and the soldiers from the British Commonwealth countries could fight in the hostile jungles just as long and just as tenaciously as the Japanese. Back at the Ramgarh Training Centre, Sun Li Ren came up with a new training program that would match the changed situation. His first entry into Burma had failed, but his second simply had to succeed. Bearing this in mind, he asked every soldier under his command to master not only shooting and close-range combat skills, but also swimming, boat piloting, river crossing with full loads, and mountain climbing. All these skills would be essential in a protracted jungle war. When his men had become sun-tanned beyond recognition and had been turned into a perfectly tuned fighting machine, Sun Li Ren wrote the following in the Handbook of the 38th Division. Trust yourself. With the correct effort, you will accomplish any task assigned to you by your commanding officers. When you're in a difficult situation, trust your commanding officers to get you out of it. When your life is in danger, trust your fellow soldiers to come to the rescue. Soon, in tropical jungles of Burma, all his efforts began to pay off. In early March 1943, Japanese troops were spotted on Savage Mountain. The new 38th Division, fully staffed and fully armed, was ready to take up the challenge. They wound up their training program ahead of schedule and set off for Lido to answer the first bugle call to charge the enemy. In May 1942, the Chinese-British Joint Army in Burma was defeated. The Japanese army took control of Burma and the British army retreated to India. In July 1942, the German-Italian Joint Army surged across North Africa and reached El Alamein in Egypt, just 350 kilometers from Cairo. In May 1943, Germany established a submarine base in Malaysia. This base was the keystone of a strategic naval alliance with Japan. Germany and Japan agreed that the two countries would use long-range submarines to attack Allied shipping on the high seas, and they demarcated 70 degrees east longitude as the dividing line of their spheres of influence. If this plan were to be implemented, then not only would Germany and Japan be genuine partners, they'd also gain control of Mid-East oil and cut off oil shipments to Britain and the Soviet Union. As well as this, they would gain control of important strategic resources in Southeast Asia, such as rubber. Once Germany and Japan were connected by a sea lane, the major problem confronting the Axis powers was British control of India. It was the only country in Asia that the UK was able to hold.
The enemy swept down to central Burma.
Because the Chinese-British Joint Army had been defeated the year before in Burma, which bordered on India, Japan now controlled Burma completely and could use it to launch an attack on India at any time. As the Allied army was in a precarious position, the US gave China much-needed supplies in order to keep the Japanese forces busy. About 80% of the Japanese land army was mired down in China, thereby making it much easier for the Allies to take on Japan in other theaters of the Pacific War. At the same time, the Chinese army that had retreated from Burma to India trained there for a year in preparation for retaking Burma and fighting their way back to China.
我们训练的也很严格，那就是一天上午2个钟头的队列训练，然后有2个钟头的这个课堂，就是射击教练啊这些步兵操练等等嘛，就是这些类的。然后就是我整个下午
就是野外训练。
你看啥子利用体型体物了？啊，代表你在现在利用你的水啊，或者利用你的水啊，你代表我掩护到你前进，你掩护到我前进。总之讲，换到现在话，利用体型体物了，代表这里一个混队，利用混队了；这里一个小团队利用就团队了，或者一点水就利用水了。看见么个利用么个，哪一个可能利用，你就利用哪样。
训练使用新式武器，那时新式武器包括3.5步枪、60炮、冲锋枪、火箭筒、战方枪，这些都是当时的最新的武器。
中国、美国、英国3个国家在南木家支持祖国势力，中国国势、美国国势、英国国势控制医疗信息，从回国3个国家算是在日本，一直在日本时间攻打华工灭。
A year earlier, American General Joseph Stilwell and Chiang Kai-shek had agreed on a plan, codenamed Anakim, A-N-A-K-I-M, to retake all of Burma. Stilwell hoped to attack Burma from India, with the British Army as the main force and American and Chinese forces in support. They would then hook up with a Chinese force of 12 divisions attacking from western Yunnan, then turn south and attack the Burmese capital of Rangoon. Anakim was dedicated to avenge the sacrifice of 60,000 soldiers of the Chinese expeditionary forces the previous year, as well as the death of several thousand servicemen at Pearl Harbor 2 years earlier.
I claim we got a hell of a beating. We got run out of Burma, and it's humiliating as hell. I think we ought to find out what caused it, go back and retake the place.
General Stilwell was the American Army commander in the China-India-Burma theatre, and he was Chiang Kai-shek's chief of staff. However, he did not have absolute authority in the theatre of operations. His job was about to become even more difficult. Military commanders must answer to their government superiors. Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin each had their own overall plans. Chiang Kai-shek was willing to launch a counter-offensive, but in order for this to happen, the British Army would have to cooperate fully. After losing more than half of his crack expeditionary force in Burma, he wanted strong backing before committing to a counter-offensive that had no guarantee of success. However, Prime Minister Churchill had little interest in the Far East theatre. He advocated putting more resources into the North African campaign in order to take the war in the West to Germany's Axis partner, Italy. Stalin, on the other hand, was completely focused on Germany. He felt that once Germany was defeated, Japan wouldn't dare attack the Soviet Union. In Roosevelt's mind, the European war was exactly that, just a war. The Asian War fell into the same category, but it was somewhat different in that the Americans wanted revenge for the attack on Pearl Harbor. A practical matter made the counter-offensive against Burma extremely urgent. China had a critical shortage of supplies. All of China's stockpiles of supplies had been used up during the many years of the war of resistance against Japanese aggression. The domestic situation, meanwhile, made it impossible for any supplies to enter the country from abroad.